Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited that you're here. We have a lot planned for you. We're going to be talking today about all things iNaturalist data, and it's a full house in terms of participants. We have people joining us globally, but also we have a full house in terms of agenda as well. So I'm going to make sure to keep us on time, and we do have questions that will be answered throughout the presentation that came from you, and we'll continue to take some questions throughout the session as well. In terms of the audience, there's a lot of you here, and we really want to get to know, more about how long have you been using iNaturalist, some more personal things about you. So we do have polls throughout the session, and that's just for us as presenters to better know who is in the room with us. And so before we introduce ourselves, we actually want to go to the first poll. And this is talking about how you use iNaturalist, essentially. So you should see this popped up on your screen. And the question is, what role best describes you? Teacher, educator, naturalist, outdoor enthusiast, land manager, park professional, scientist, researcher, or other. And this is multiple choice. We understand probably many of you, maybe most of you, fall into multiple categories. And you have about 1 minute to do this poll. So if you can, if you're able, just do your submission. We'll keep it open for about 50 more seconds. And so while we have it open, I would love to just ask both Scott and Carrie, if you had to pick a role that best describes you now in your current state of who you are, what would you pick? What role best describes you, Carrie?
If I can only pick one, I guess I'd pick naturalist. At other times in my life, I would have picked educator or scientist, but now naturalist.
Yeah, I feel
What
similar.
about you?
Yeah, like Carrie, I'm a recovering academic, so in the past I probably would have said researcher, but happy to say naturalist.
I love it. Love it. We all evolve. Okay. And I will share verbally a couple of the results here. So the biggest one in the room today is outdoor enthusiast. Yes, that's how I would probably describe myself. So that's at 63%. And naturalist is at 46%. We also have scientist researcher coming at 19%, and then teacher educator at 15%, and other at 13%, which I would love to, if we had more time, I'd love to know more about what the other is, but I will force us to move on. And now we're going to go up to our introductions, and I will kick us off here. So it's so nice to meet many of you. I am new to my role as the head of development. My name is Michelle Vryn, and I have been in this role for 5 months or so. And it's a really exciting time for iNaturalist, and I feel really fortunate to be a part of a passionate group of people. And I am based in Texas. So Carrie, let me kick it over to you to do your self-intro.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Seltzer. I am the head of engagement for iNaturalist. I joined the team in 2018, and I've worn a lot of different hats. And I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C.
Scott, round us out.
Yeah, and hi, everybody. I'm Scott Loarie. I'm the executive director of iNaturalist. I've been working on iNaturalist since 2011, and it's been so fun to see that grow and see what it's become. And I'm joining from the San Francisco Bay Area.
Awesome. So one of our main, I think, goals of presenting this topic was to talk about, what happens with iNaturalist data and how are you involved in it. So you have to kind of go high level of, big term impact and scale, and then we're going to go more down to the individual level, and are there specific things you can do as an observer. But we're going to open up with a large scale view of iNaturalist data. So Scott has some good slides prepared for us with some amazing visuals. So I will let you go ahead and share your screen.
Great. Yeah, no, I'm happy to, we spend a lot of time with iNaturalist talking about connecting people to nature, getting people outdoors, and that's obviously a huge part of what we do. But it's super fun today to get to talk about data, and because one of the things I think a lot of people just don't realize with iNaturalist is how important how important iNaturalist is for science. And so just getting started with that, I mean, this is really motivated by a really a big crisis that's happening in biodiversity. Why do we need biodiversity data? Over 1 million species are threatened with extinction this century. So just a core part of what we're trying to do with iNaturalist is address that threat. And particularly, that threat is motivated by the fact that we just don't have the biodiversity data that we need to make good decisions, let alone a constituency of people who actually want to take on this threat. And that's another part of iNaturalist. But I think a key part of this is just that we have this incredible extinction threat that we're facing right now. And even if we had a motivated constituency of the public wanting to do something about it, we don't know what to do. We don't have the biodiversity data that we need to address this threat. And that's where I think iNaturalist comes in. So, our mission is to connect people to nature, and that's getting people involved, getting people engaged, but also to generate the data that we can do to advance biodiversity science and conservation. So what are we doing? Like all of us together, the iNaturalist community, we're crowdsourcing one of the world's largest, most important biodiversity data sets. I love this figure. This is the globe, and every orange dot there is an observation that's made in about an hour. So this hour, this conversation where we expect about 5,000 new observations, and those white lines are the identifications of someone identifying what those observations are. And so again, this hour, we expect about 12,000 identifications. So it really is this amazing community we have on iNaturalist of general average normal people outside exploring their backyards and expert naturalists who are helping turn this into such an important data set. So that's just one of the things I wanted to talk about next is what does this data set look like? So these are observations, points in space and time that have a photo or maybe a sound associated with them that everybody's sharing and getting identified and hopefully turned into research grade observations. And again, as we mentioned, iNaturalist was launched as a master's project in 2008. And the number of observations has been slowly growing over time. The big signal here is we call the spring bump. So there's just more people and there's more iNaturalist activity in the Northern Hemisphere. So we're always going to see more activity in the summer. But you see the spring bump, things kind of peak kind of about now in the Northern Hemisphere summer, and then go back down for the Northern Hemisphere winter. And this summer, we passed 6 million observations per month, which is pretty exciting. And also 200 million observations in total. So what's neat about that data is that all of the licensed, and Carrie's going to talk about what licensing means, research grade observations get shared with something called GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And GBIF really is this incredible hub of biodiversity data coming from 100,000 data sets from around the world from 3,000 different publishers. So it's a great place for scientists to take the pulse of biodiversity data. And what I wanted to do is take the opportunity to talk about how iNaturalist compares to other data sets through GBIF. And I think this will really make the point about what an important and unique data set iNaturalist is that you guys are contributing to get into GBIF. So the point on a map, a lot of these studies have to do with the point on a map. This is where is a species in space and time. And what's interesting is this graph here, the x-axis is the number of species represented in these different data sets in GBIF, and the y-axis is the number of observations. So iNaturalist doesn't actually, even though it's such a large data set, it doesn't really stand out as an outlier in terms of the size, the number of observations. One data set does. Anybody guess what that one is? It's eBird, which is amazing. I mean, and I know many of you contribute also to eBird, but eBird's generated 1.2 billion observations in the last decade, which is just an amazing feat. But eBird will never generate more than 1,000 species because there's only 10,000 species because there's only 10,000 species of birds. And a lot of these other data sets are about as large as iNaturalist, but again, they're sort of not passing that 50,000 species mark. A lot of those are big data sets from Europe, big European recording efforts. So what's really unique about iNaturalist is of all the data sets in GBIF, it has the most species. It's currently the only thing in the world that's able to census hundreds of thousands of species annually. And that's because iNaturalist is bringing data on plants, insects, into the mix, which is really unique. So I just want to emphasize that one thing that's really, really unique about the iNaturalist data set is this unique ability to census hundreds of thousands of species on an annual basis. There's other studies that aren't using the point on the map. They're using things like the photo, patterns in the images, things like that. And that's where iNaturalist really does stand out. We have the most images of any data set in GBIF. In fact, 72% of the images from the last decade on GBIF are from iNaturalist. So that's pretty impressive as well. Sound, I know there's been a lot of interest from the iNaturalist community in sound. You can record sound with iNaturalist, but it hasn't been sort of elevated to the status of photos on the site. That's one of the things we're interested in thinking about more. But iNaturalist, even with what we've done, is a big contributor to sound. It's second to Xenocanto, which is a site that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So what's cool is another thing that GBIF does is it takes from all these 100,000 data sets, and it tracks how many of them were cited in scientific publications. So it's a really useful thing with GBIF is that you can look and say, hey, how many times was iNaturalist cited in scientific publications? And one of the things we're really proud of is iNaturalist has the most citations of any publisher in GBIF, over 5,000. And I think that's proportional to this number of species, because if there's a study published using GBIF data, chances are there's a bit of iNaturalist data mixed in there as well. And that's just because so many different species are represented in the iNat data set. And that's, as I mentioned, where we're really unique. So I want to talk just quickly about these different types of studies. Some of the studies are really based on a single observation that is so exciting and noteworthy that that's a whole publication itself. One that just popped up this month that I was really excited about was Gonadactylus found this elm zigzag sawfly in Minnesota, which is a species from Europe that is a pest of elm trees, and it's been invading the United States. It's common in the eastern United States, and it's sort of slowly pushing to the the northwest. And it just showed up for the first time in Minnesota. So here's a situation where just one observation made it onto the desk of the Minnesota Department of Food and Agriculture, and it's a publication, and it's an exciting observation in its own right. Other things in that category, I'd say, are new species discoveries. We have new species that are described on iNaturalist, rediscoveries of species that have been lost for hundreds of years. And in all those cases, it's the single observation that is the story. But most of these studies actually combine tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of observations into a single study. This is a paper that came out last month that I really liked. I was really excited about. So this was a study that took 10,000 images. So again, it's not just the point of the map. They also took the point of the map, but the images themselves, and used those images in a computer vision machine learning framework to understand when Joshua trees are flowering. And then based on those flowering patterns and the geographic patterns, understand how Joshua trees are responding to climate change. And we're able to even project back 120 years into sort of this relationship between climate and Joshua tree flowering phenology. So that's a situation where pretty much if you've taken an observation of a Joshua tree on iNaturalist, it's almost guaranteed to have been in this paper. And this figure here has 4 different iNaturalist observations that we can link right back to those observations. So again, you might not even know that your observation in these cases was used, but there's just so many studies coming out of GBIF that are using this data, and this is a great example. One of the things we did is we tried to take those 5,000 different studies in GBIF and categorize them into these different categories. And so one is climate change impacts. This is where that Joshua tree study would fall, and that's the most common. That's the most common type of study that we found. The second broadly is conservation, biodiversity management. The third, invasive species ecology. So this is where that sawfly, the elm sawfly study would fall. Next is phylogenetics, biogeography, evolution, just basic understanding of species evolution, things like that. Ecological interactions, habitat dynamics. So these are species eating other species, species interactions with their habitat. And then miscellaneous, which would be anything from agricultural studies, human health studies, things like that. And then I also wanted to lastly just say that, the impact that iNaturalist has on science and conservation doesn't just come through published studies. So much of it also comes through grassroots actions that people are doing. And there's so many examples of this on iNaturalist. This is one that I love, which is a group that's involved in monitoring newts, which are these migratory salamanders. And so part of the project is figuring out where these newts are, where they're crossing roads, but also to go a step further and actually design little underpasses, little culverts that these newts can pass under. So they'll say, this is a place where these newts are getting run over on the road. That's great that we know that, but now let's actually go from data to action and put a culvert in and make sure that these newts can cross safely. So there's just so many different ways that this data turns into impact for science and conservation. A lot of it is through traditional science, and that's what we can track in GBIF, but a lot of it is through these grassroots projects as well. So that's, I'm gonna stop sharing.
That's amazing. And while you're taking down your screen share, I'll take this moment to remind everyone that if you love the graphs as much as I do in those slides, this PowerPoint is going to be available to you. So we not only want you to access it and share it with people, but please feel free to share all of the graphics with others, because it really helps to paint the story when we're talking about something at such a high level. It's super handy to have those charts and graphs, and also just give a plug to Scott here. Like he does most of those himself. He's very good at it. And please like share his work so we can all better tell the story of iNaturalist impact.
The recovering academic.
Recovering academic. It's still with him. It's still with him, guys. Okay. So we had, I mean, just tons of great questions submitted. So thank you all, first of all, for all of your amazing questions. And we've pulled a couple for Scott here to answer. And I think some of them do tie back into your slides for sure. You touched on this a little bit, but I think it's important enough to underscore again, which is someone really wanted to know, are all observations useful? So, you know, I think a lot of times we feel like we're taking observations of something that seems common, or how do we need to be more discerning in what we post to iNaturalist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just want to remind people that, you know, if you want to record something, you should record it. Like for me, I love anytime I'm in a new spot, you know, at least making an observation so that I can kind of keep track of where I'm going. So, you know, don't feel ashamed of posting anything that you want to post if it's a living organism. And so that really is the first user of this data is yourself. But then the really exciting thing about science is that you never know what someone's going to use. And that's what's so great about these tools like GBIF. We get this information in a GBIF. We never know if you might be, wow, this is another mallard. There's hundreds of thousands of photos of mallards on iNaturalist, but maybe someone's going to do this really exciting study on mallard feathers, and your observation is going to be an important part of that story, and you never know. So I do say that any observation is important. But then, you know, no question that these filling gaps, and we have, you know, within iNaturalist, things like the computer vision model that we're trying to build, you know, there's key gaps in those. And Carrie's going to talk a lot more about this, but tend to be taxa that are overlooked, different kinds of species that are overlooked, different places that people don't tend to go. So I would say broadly, if you're in a taxonomic group or a geographic area that is underrepresented, those observations are specifically of interest to us and probably scientists as well, even though you never know.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Okay, so the next question is talking more about like the data to action. We received this question in a couple of forms, and I've actually asked it myself as well. So I'm curious your answer. Is there any way to know which of your observations are actually being used in published papers? Because if so, like, you know, I think people want to know what those papers are and would love to read them.
Yeah, you know, there's not great tools for that right now. That's something I'd love for there to be better. And maybe through this GBIF tool that we were talking about, we do it then our year in review. We mentioned the most cited papers from that queue, and it's very easy to browse through those papers, but it's harder to connect the dots to the individual, to your observations. We do in our monthly highlights, though, we try to highlight studies. So last month we highlighted that yucca study. I'm sorry, the Joshua tree study. So if you posted an observation of a Joshua tree, it probably was represented. And just the fact that there's so many publications coming out of GBIF, if your data is getting into GBIF, which Carrie will talk more about, probably guarantee that it's in a lot of papers, but it would be great, I agree, to have better tools for actually tracing that.
Yep. Well, Scott, that was great high-level information. And again, please share these slides with others. We'll probably give that plug again at the end. But this moves us to talking more about what can you do at the individual level. We just came like from a really high altitude. We're going to move more to the individual level. But before we do that, I want to introduce our next poll, which is going to be asking you, like, who do you typically iNat with? So when you go out and you're making your observations, are you someone who really tries to do it with family? Is it more like a friend thing? Maybe colleagues. I think for, of course, a lot of our land managers, maybe like colleagues. Or are you just someone who likes to go out and observe solo? And again, we'll have about 60 seconds to answer this poll. So please get your answers in, because I really want to know your answer to this. I will say for me, I'm more of maybe a solo person because I take a long time. I think a lot of people don't want to wait with me. I slow down the walks for sure, which maybe some of you do that with your friends groups as well. But Carrie, tell me, I have to know like real quickly, which bucket do you fall into?
All of the above. Family, friends, colleagues, by myself. Sometimes I just really love going out by myself and being able to go really slow for for a couple of hours.
Fair. Scott, what about you?
Last couple of years, I've probably been family, which means very opportunistic, and probably quality of my photos has definitely suffered as a result.
Yes, I have 2 dogs personally, so I feel like I never get really good quality photos, but they enjoy the walks. Okay, great. So thank you for submitting the answers, and let's see. Here are the results. 82% of people said they do it solo. You're making me feel so much better about myself because this is really, I'm a very friendly person, but I do like to go alone for my observations. And that is followed by family at 24%, friends at 23%, and then colleagues at 14%. I really think going out and like doing more observations with colleagues is something we can probably take more advantage of. It's a great team building exercise and you get to learn more about people. So thank you for
Bioblitzes,
participating
what do
in
those
that.
count as?
The
Friends,
which
I guess?
ones?
Bioblitz.
Yeah,
Colleagues or friends.
bioblitzes. Yeah, good point. Okay, so we've talked about high level data with Scott. Now we're taking more of like at the individual perspective. What should you be thinking about to level up your data game here? And Carrie's going to walk us through that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michelle. And thanks for queuing up the big picture, Scott. I'm going to focus now on the really tangible things that you can do to increase your positive impact for biodiversity through what you do on iNaturalist. So you can think of this as a menu. I'm giving you 3 ways here. There's many more, but we're just going to focus on 3 to keep it simple. One is through the observations that you make. I'm going to give tips for improving the impact of them. Another way is through identifications. And I know that some of you on this call are already stellar at making identifications. You do this so much. I see you. Thank you. For those of you who've never done this, we'll give you a little bit of framework for getting started and some tips. And then the third one is definitely the nerdiest one, but it's super important. So stay with me on this for some tips about how licensing increases the impact of your iNaturalist contributions. So when it comes to observations, I'm going to talk about 3 areas that you could focus on. One is photo quality. 2 is filling a gap on the map, and this is something Scott referenced earlier. 3 is focusing on the less commonly observed species. So when it comes to photo quality, just with whatever camera or phone you've got, just some real high-level simple tips. The first one is filling the frame. So this could be in the form of, getting closer to whatever it is that you're looking at, assuming it's safe to do so, or cropping your photos afterwards before you post them to iNaturalist so that it's easier at a glance for someone to see what you're focused on. We've all taken those distant bird photos or that butterfly that's hard to distinguish from the flowers, so that's where cropping can really help. Another thing is tapping, if you're working with your phone, which I expect most people are, using the tap to focus to try to get it to focus on the right part of what it is that you're looking at, or even putting your hand behind the flower or the leaf or whatever it is to really sort of give your phone a greater surface area for focusing. I'm right-handed. I have a ton of iNat observations that include my left hand because of that focus trick. When it comes to what to photograph, this is also a really important part of taking higher quality observations that are easier for people to identify. When it comes to mushrooms, you really want to get the top of the mushroom, the side of the mushroom, and the underside of the mushroom. So when you think about mushroom, the next time you see a mushroom, you should think to yourself, I need three photos, not just one. You need 3 photos, and sometimes you need a lot more. Mushrooms are tricky, fungi are complicated, but at least if you're only taking 1 photo of a mushroom right now, this will be an improvement. When it comes to plants, taking pictures that are focused on different parts of the plant is a huge help for identification. Flowers are a big help if they're there, fruit if they're there. The leaves, a clear shot of the leaf so that you can see the whole leaf shape, but not only the top of the leaf, the underside of the leaf. Sometimes leaves look really different on the underside, and that can be really important for distinguishing. Buds, especially if there aren't leaves, And then taking a step back and looking at that whole plant, because sometimes just kind of the shape of the plant or the way it grows can be a really distinguishing feature. So the next area where you could focus with observations is on filling a gap in the map of iNat observations. So the way you can do this is by exploring maps of existing observations on iNaturalist. I think we're going to put a link in chat to where you can do that on the website. And I do recommend trying this on the website, especially if you've only used the mobile app. Take a look at the iNaturalist website. It's really got more tools for exploring what other people have seen. So, you can just sort of start wherever you are right now, and then look around from there. Are there parks nearby you, even in the middle of cities? Are there parks nearby that maybe don't have very many observations yet? So find a place that doesn't have very many observations relative to other areas, and go make observations there. And bonus points if you can try to find and observe as many different species as possible. You can even just give yourself like 30 minutes. How many species can I take photos and make observations of in the next 30 minutes? But this gap filling is just so important. And we're all in different places, and there are things that you can find. Maybe you even take them for granted because they're so common where you live, but they're not necessarily common elsewhere. And so this is really, really an important way that you can make a contribution. Or even when you're traveling, are you taking a road trip? Look along the way and see if there's places you can stop and add some observations. Another area is focusing on the less commonly observed species. Like Scott mentioned, all observations can be useful in ways that we can't necessarily anticipate yet, but we know that there's especially a need for these less commonly observed species. And I also want to clarify that this doesn't necessarily mean endangered species. This can just be things that other people don't pay a lot of attention to. Why does this matter? We have more than 300,000 species where we've got at least one observation on iNaturalist, but we don't have enough data to actually be able to model their ranges or suggest them for visual similarity in our AI identification tools. So you can really make a valuable contribution by focusing on things that are sometimes overlooked, like small insects or spiders, things that aren't necessarily the most charismatic things that get a lot of attention. And for these, I just want to emphasize that clear photos and a lot of patience will help. And I mean patience in how long it might take for them to get identified on iNaturalist. And this can be an area too where building your own expertise can really make a big difference. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And another way that you can do this is by redocumenting less common species that you've already seen once in different places and over time. So maybe you see it early in the season and you're able to revisit and take a picture of it later in the season. That's helpful information because if we think about plants, for example, which is often where my mind goes, I photograph a lot of plants. You might catch it in flower initially, and then you can go back and see it in fruit, and those are both helpful, even if it's the same plant. So I want to show an example of an observation that I made earlier this year that turned out to be a really uncommonly observed species on iNaturalist so far. So what you're looking at here is a leaf, and there's little tracks in that leaf because there is a leaf miner inside. And leaf miners are like little fly larvae or caterpillars sometimes that eat between the two layers of the leaf and make these little tunnels. And I happen to know that this was on a species called coralberry. That's the host plant. And these are often very particular about which species you'll find them, species of plants you'll find them on. So thankfully, I suspected this. I knew it was a leaf miner. I suspected it was a leaf miner fly, and that was my initial identification. But then Charlie Eisman, C. Eisman there, came in and added a species level identification. And whenever I get a new to me species or something that sounds unfamiliar, what I do is I click through for more information about that species on the taxon page. And honestly, I'm very often looking at how many other observations are there of this species on iNaturalist so far. And for this one, it's only 17. So this means that the next time I'm in a place where I see that host plant, coralberry, I'll be looking for this leaf miner too, because I know that it's not a species that's well documented yet, even though it's possible that this is quite common. We're just not necessarily paying close attention to it. Now I want to shift gears and talk about identifications on iNaturalist. And especially here, I'm referring to identifications that you make on other people's observations. I want to acknowledge that there's two separate skills here. One of the skills is using the tools that iNaturalist has, especially on the website, for adding identifications. But separate from that is the expertise in actually distinguishing and being able to identify different types of organisms or species in the first place. So some of you might be real internet savvy, very comfortable using iNat's tools. Maybe you don't have a lot of expertise in identification. And some of you are the opposite. I'm sure that there are some folks who have a wealth of expertise in identifying things in the field, but aren't familiar with iNat's tools. So I want to give a few tips to address both groups. When it comes to using the tools that iNat has, here's some four simple steps that I recommend. You can use the identify tool on the website, which lets you work most quickly and efficiently. And we're going to drop a link in chat so you can check that out, as well as a tutorial so you can get familiar with that. And that lets you filter pretty easily by place. So I recommend choosing a place that you're familiar with, probably, well, depending on where you are, you might want to choose a country or a state or a county level place, perhaps a park even. Then you can begin adding identifications once you've sort of narrowed your focus. And the last step, especially once you start adding identifications for other people, is it's important to stay up on notifications in case someone else comes in and disagrees with your identification, asks more questions. It's a great way to learn and start a dialogue on iNaturalist, but it means you should pay attention to those daily update emails that you might not be opening, or checking back on the website. You might not see those notifications within the mobile app. This other piece of identifying on iNaturalist is building expertise if you don't have it already, or further developing it. So if you want to start adding identifications, and I want to emphasize that this is something that everyone can do. This is within everyone's reach. I recommend you start with broad, correct labels that you're really confident about, and that can just be plants, birds, fungi. It doesn't have to be species level identifications. Because once you get them into those broad categories, then they can be picked up more easily by people who are looking to identify mushrooms, for example, or who want to identify birds. Birds tend to move pretty quickly once they're identified as birds, even if it just says birds. And then you can learn from the more specific identifications that follow your coarser identification. And one of the ways to do that is by asking questions and learning how to distinguish things. So you shouldn't just agree with other identifications without doing your own investigation and follow-up. It's fine to just not update your identification. You can just keep it at the very coarse level. And lastly, I want to emphasize that we just have some absolutely incredible expertise within the iNaturalist community, and some of them have really done great efforts to help other people develop that expertise too. It just so happens right before this webinar started, a field guide got delivered to the velvet ants of North America, and the first author on this book, Kevin Williams, identified some of my velvet ant observations that I made last month, and so I was motivated to buy the field guide to learn more about velvet ants. So there's so many examples of that, and please explore. You can develop this expertise too with the tools that are out there. All right, this last piece is licensing. So the licensing on your photos, your observation itself, and your sounds if you have them. Why does it matter? It matters because licenses tell other people how you want your data used or not used. And the Global Biodiversity Information Facility that Scott referenced a lot in his presentation, it only takes records with specific open licenses. And when we get more data, more openly accessible through GBIF, it is more accessible for science and more exciting things can happen to understand and protect biodiversity. So I'm not going to go into all of these in great detail, but what I want to highlight is that we use something called Creative Commons licenses, and there are several different versions. We've indicated here which ones are appropriate for sharing with GBIF and which ones are appropriate for sharing with Wikimedia. GBIF in green, Wikimedia in blue. What's most important is that some of you, many of you even, probably have no license right now, which is at the bottom here, no license, all rights reserved. And if you have that on your observations, this section is really for you. And I want to convince you why you should change that to create more open data. Because one way to think about licenses is that they give permission in advance. So for example, this presentation and Scott's is licensed with a Creative Commons by or attribution license so that you can reuse this presentation, you can sub in your own screenshots, you can change the styles. You don't have to ask us for permission as long as you credit iNaturalist as the source. So that's what Creative Commons attribution or CC BY, that's what that license means. So I want to convince you to change with a tale of two observations. The first observation was made by my dad. This is an observation of a fox. It's research grade. It was confirmed by other members of the community. The other observation was made by my mom. This is a beetle, a research grade beetle. So in the case of the fox observation made by my dad, if you look at it on the website and you scroll down the page, you can see in that orange box that my dad has an observation license of CC BY NC, which means that he's giving permission for it to be used with attribution non-commercially. And so this observation is, if you scroll further down the page, you can see that it is shared with GBIF, as well as another program called EdMaps. In contrast, my mom's beetle observation, also research grade, but if you scroll down on this one, in that copyright info section, you can see that it doesn't have a Creative Commons license. It's all rights reserved, which means that if you scroll further, you can see the message that even though it's research grade, it's not licensed for reuse, and so it's not shared with GBIF. I don't know if you noticed, but my mom has 240 observations. My dad has 2 observations, but because of my dad's open license choice, his data, his one research grade observation is more accessible for science and all of the downstream impacts that come from open data. Worked with my mom and she has updated her license. So I hope that you will too. This is something you can do in your iNaturalist account settings, and we will be or have shared a link in chat for that. You will need to log in on the website because it's not available in the app. But when it comes to these account settings, just remember the best of settings are the CC0, CC BY, CC BY NC, and we've got visual indicators for you to be able to pull these out. And the worst of settings is all rights reserved because it really limits how accessible your observations are for science more broadly. So just a quick recap, you're going to open your account settings, select licenses. There's 3 different things you can license. Your observation itself, which you can think of as like a row of data in a spreadsheet, the photos and the sounds. And once you've updated to one of these open sharing Creative Commons licenses for your observations, next week when we do the GBIF update, your observations will also be shared in GBIF. We'll send follow-up with more instructions about this, so don't worry, you don't need to do it right now, and we'll make these slides available. So I would love to know now, we're going to put up another poll of these 3 things. Which are you planning to do? You don't have to do them all. You can just pick one, or you can pick them all. While you are thinking about that, I just want to leave you with the reminder that no one can do everything, but everyone can do something for biodiversity, and there's something that you are uniquely positioned to do.
I love that, Carrie. Thank you so much for walking us through that. It was very tactical. I learned a lot, and I love your mom's example too. I was going to ask you if you convinced her to change it. I mean, I figured you did, but that was a very good story.
Yeah, thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Mom. Thanks for letting us share your example. Okay, so we will close the poll after probably about 40 seconds or so. I'm not sure how much time we have left. We'll let you know what are most people feeling that the action they're going to take is. I'm curious on this one as well. Okay, so we have 85% of people said observations are going to be the area they enhance. 83% of people said open licensing. Thank you. Carrie, you were very convincing. You did your job well. Identifications came in at 53%. So this is great. I'm excited for these next steps. Amazing. Okay, so we are moving into, I think, maybe the funnest part, which is really addressing the questions that you all submitted. And we've taken a couple as well from today, our session today. And this is going to be, I say quite like a rapid fire Q&A, but we have so many questions. We can take a minute or so to answer them. But Carrie, I hope you've caught your breath because the first question is for you. And this question is asking about how can someone improve the way they take pictures on their Android device? They say, I can never get close enough to an insect.
I love this. I love this. So sneaking up on bugs is a great skill. So I've got 2 tips. One is that remember that if the problem you're having is that the bug like flies away before you can get close enough to get a good photo, really like pay attention to where your shadow is, because sometimes your shadow will, if your shadow goes over the bug before you get there, that might be enough to frighten the bug, so that it flies away and you can't get a photo. The other tip is that you can get clip-on macro lenses really quite cheaply, like maybe $10 US, that can dramatically increase your ability to take photos of very small things like insects. And if you can get close enough to it safely without it flying away, you can really use those clip-on macros to get a lot closer and get those details that you really might need to get better identifications.
Super helpful, Carrie. Your answer made me chuckle because I've been blaming my dogs on not being able to get the insect photos, but it may in fact just be my own shadow. So I'll keep a better eye out for that. All right, so next we're tossing it over back to Scott, and this is a Seek related question. So can you clarify the difference between Seek and iNaturalist, and how should you think about when to use each one?
Yeah, so Seek is really designed to be sort of a privacy-focused experience. So the main reason we built it was for kids, because we were getting so many schools that said we really want to use iNaturalist in the classroom. But because iNaturalist at its core is a social network, and even before we had AI, the only way to get an identification was to post it and share it. And so you in the United States, we have this law called COPPA, the Child Online Privacy Protection Act. You can't join iNaturalist or Facebook or any of these other social networks unless you're 13. So that's when we had this computer vision, we said, wow, this is so cool. We can make a child privacy focused app, and Seek's really designed it around that. It's even published in the Apple App Store as a kids app, which really constrains the data that can be collected. What we've learned is that Seek is actually very popular with even botanists and biologists, which was unexpected for us. And I think when we're doing a big update on the iNaturalist mobile app, and we're trying to learn a lot of lessons from Seek on just how to make things easy to use. But that was the sort of intent with Seek, was not sharing data, privacy focused, kids focused, whereas iNaturalist, the focus really is on recording, documenting, generating data, sharing data.
Got it. Very helpful. Okay, Carrie, I'm going back to you. So this person specifically asked, I'll just actually read the question verbatim. Do I have to share my observation for it to be helpful? Rarely am I seeking feedback, so I don't share it.
So there's sort of two answers to this. One is if you are perfectly satisfied not sharing your observation because it was just for your own curiosity, that's fine. And that is what Seek is especially good at. But if you want to collect data and contribute to this just incredible wealth of data that enables all of these powerful insights about biodiversity at scales from hyper-local to global, then yes, share your observations. Even share your observations of the species that you think are common and boring, because you might, like Scott mentioned, we don't know how these might be useful, and it might turn out that what you thought was a common and boring thing actually wasn't. It was maybe something that looked similar, but wasn't what you thought.
Got it. Okay. Scott, I have a couple of questions grouped for you underneath the theme of just research grade and like how observations are used. But this first one, I think, is a pain that many people can probably relate to. And the person asks, I have quite a few posts that need ID. Is there anything that can be done to get input on those posts?
Yeah, and this is, when I saw the poll and, the identifications comes up lowest, that is something that I've heard, talked to a lot of people in the naturalist community, which are concerned. Are we scaling the identifier community as fast as we're scaling the observer community? It's harder to do. I mean, we found things like City Nature Challenge that are just these incredibly amazing tools for getting lots and lots of people out observing. We're really focused on trying to find ways to grow the expertise, the identifier community within iNaturalist. And I think there's sort of two ways to do it. One is to try to onboard more experts. And, we're really interested in that. If you are a taxonomic expert and are using iNat, or even if you're here and you're not using iNat, we'd love to hear from you. Like what helps you, what motivates you to engage and contribute. The other thing is building expertise. If we can figure out ways to build up expertise, get kind of some of the things Carrie were saying, to get people into, for me, it was having kids. I was much more an observer. And then when I had young kids, I was just stuck at home, and I sort of forced myself to become an IDer, and now I'm in the cockpit with identifications. But I think it's a harder hump to get people over. So just finding ways to do that. So I think the AI is obviously a tool. Our intention with that was to help make ID more efficient, but we want to be, it also has the potential to sort of pervert the expertise in weird ways. And we're very interested in figuring out ways to make the AI continue to complement the expertise of humans and be reinforced by the expertise of experts in a good way. So just to say, it's really on our radar. It's something that we're taking very, very seriously. I think we're going to try a lot of different things in 2025, but right now, I agree. I do think the observers is sort of scaling a little faster than the identifiers.
Can I give just a little,
Please, Carrie,
maybe
please.
they can do? So one thing that you can do with some of those observations that maybe have been in the needs ID category for a long time is, let's say you've got a pretty high level broad identification, just try to get it like a little closer. You don't have to jump all the way to species, but sometimes getting something to the level of family is enough for it to get noticed by people who have expertise who can take it further. So I would say try to like move your identifications just a little further.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's very doable too. I mean, thinking even for myself, it's very tactical. Okay, so Scott, this is a good one as well. Does an observation necessarily need to be research grade to be valuable for scientific research?
No, and the story of research grade was funny because it was actually an internal label that we were using when we were first having a conversation with GBIF about what to share. And they said, we want all observations that are at species level, at least finer than family, with 2 or more identifications. We don't want the captive cultivated stuff. obviously the license thing. So we were like, okay, we'll call that research grade, and we just kind of coded that into the software, and then it somewhat surfaced, and now, for better or for worse, it's become something that people have like really are invested in. There's a lot of emotions behind research grade, either bad, people like, what do this isn't, like you're saying, a perfect discriminator of what research is, or good, because it is feel like it's a easy, simple way to know that you're contributing. I'd say the biggest way is, so right now we have captive cultivated tangled up in research grade. I know a lot of people have concerns about this, and there's a lot of, I'd say, especially for places like New Zealand, where scientists want to know even what's in cultivation there, because those have the potential in island places like New Zealand or Hawaii, where there's the threats from invasives are just so big, what escapes. So there's actually a ton of science that's going on in New Zealand based on planted plants and things like that. So that's a good example where research grade doesn't map to useful for science perfectly. And I know there's a lot of conversations about evolving research grade, either by changing the criteria to try to make it map better to high quality, or find ways for it to represent things like the importance of captive cultivated things. But those are probably longer term. But I'd say in the short term, and I also probably did overly emphasize GBIF. There's plenty of scientists that come straight to iNaturalist and use our the API or the exports that we make, the iNaturalist tools to get through the Amazon Open Data Program. So there's lots of different tools that scientists are pulling data from iNaturalist that might not be including what goes into GBIF. But what goes into GBIF is that research grade subset.
Got it. Okay. Okay, Carrie, I'm gonna go back to you here, and this was one of my favorite questions. I know you're gonna have a good answer to it. So an audience member asked, do you have any training or motivation tips for iNaturalist evangelists, and specifically if they're trying to motivate non-scientist friends to join them?
I love this. And I think the best advice that I have is to keep it simple, try to meet people where they are. And for a lot of people, Seek is a real gateway. And a lot of people, love Seek and never want to use anything else. But for some people, Seek is a gateway much deeper into iNaturalist. And I know we have many people who are watching who do identify as like deep in iNaturalist. And I think that the more you know about something, the harder it is to make it simple for other people. I experienced this just in preparation for this event, right? So take advantage of these slides, and just try not to overwhelm people. Let them get their feet wet and see what happens.
Yeah, I love that. Beautiful.
I should say too that there is a way from Seek to post data to iNaturalist. I didn't want to all be dismissive of that. I mean, we know there's many seekers out there who love Seek, and we're not trying to change the way you're doing things. And you can, I know people who post individually every observation through Seek to iNaturalist, and if that works for you, that's great.
Yeah. I guess kind of a follow-up question, Carrie, on, being a better spreader of the word of iNaturalist. There was a couple of questions that touched on, can the public use our branding materials to help market our mission or kind of get others to join the platform?
For sure. One of the things we didn't really talk about hardly at all is projects on iNaturalist, and how so many organizations have used projects to advance their mission. And so, promoting iNaturalist in the context of a project, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of organizations. And we're so grateful for all of those organizations that are helping spread the word about iNaturalist. And if you're in that position and you want to make a sign for a trailhead that says, while you're here, post your observations to iNaturalist. I think we can drop a link in chat to our little press page where you can find those logos if you're going to make anything permanent, like, please send us an email, but please, feel free to link to us from other places on the internet and use our logo to spread the word about what you can do with iNaturalist.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for that. And thank you for dropping that link, Walker. Okay, so we're almost at time here, and I just want to reiterate, you all had so many great questions. We've not completely dismissed all of them, like we're thinking through internally. How can we continue to answer some of these, in the coming future, whether that be on social media or we don't know yet, but keep an eye out on our channels, and because your questions were really fabulous. But I'm going to go ahead and close this out. We're 1 minute till. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. And I know a lot of the content shared, it seemed like it was just biodiversity data, but it's the data you all have enabled. So I just want to take this moment to say, that your actions, your observations, your identifications matter, and you're uniquely positioned to capture details about nature in your area, right? So, and if you get stuck or if you have questions, remember there's literally a whole global community of people that want to help you and want you to succeed. And fun fact, like iNaturalist was actually coined the nicest place on the internet in a New York Times article. So people are very friendly. They definitely want to help you. So don't ever hesitate to lean on the community if there's some kind of problem you're bumping up against. But look out for the email with the recording. We again will have this posted to our YouTube channel and all the slides, like we want you to share them. So please do that. And maybe someone who is excited about nature and they just haven't signed up for the app yet, and this is like the last push they need to get them over. So feel free to use these materials. But thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time. So